The year was 1971, and my first month as a night technician at a sleepy Alabama radio station quickly turned into a nightmare. They told me never to interrupt the broadcast, but what do you do when the broadcast itself is interrupted by something impossible? Something whispering numbers, coordinates, and military code, heard by every listener except the guy in the control room. This is the story of the night WBMG went dark. I was still getting used to the solitude that came with working alone in the station after midnight. The building itself was from the 1940s, and you could hear it settling at night. Creaks, groans, the usual sounds of an old structure. But it paid well for someone fresh out of technical school, so I wasn't complaining. The station had one strict rule that my supervisor drilled into me during training. Never interrupt the broadcast for any reason unless it was an official emergency alert from the authorities. The FCC took that stuff seriously, and the station could lose its license. So no matter what happened, the show had to go on. That particular night was quieter than usual. Our overnight programming was mostly pre-recorded shows and music, so I didn't expect any trouble. I settled into the control room with my thermos of coffee and a stack of equipment logs to update. Around 2:30 a.m., I noticed something odd. The audio meter was showing fluctuations that didn't match what was playing on air. At first, I thought it might be interference from a nearby station bleeding into our frequency. It happens sometimes, especially late at night when atmospheric conditions were right. I adjusted the equipment and the fluctuations stopped. Everything seemed normal again, so I made a note in the log and went back to my coffee. But about 10 minutes later, the phone rang. That was unusual. We rarely got calls during the overnight shift. It was a woman's voice on the other end. She sounded elderly, maybe in her 70s. She asked if I was the one running the station tonight, and I confirmed that I was. Then she said something that made me sit up straight. "You need to check your broadcast. There's another voice coming through." I told her I just checked everything and it was working fine, but she insisted. She said she'd been listening for the past 20 minutes and there was definitely someone else talking underneath the music. A man's voice, she said, speaking very quietly, almost like he was whispering. I assured her I would look into it and hung up. I immediately put on my headphones and listened carefully to the live broadcast feed. Nothing, just a smooth voice of our pre-recorded host and the music playing between segments. I figured the old lady was maybe half asleep and imagining things, or perhaps her radio was malfunctioning. But then the phone rang again. Different caller, younger voice, same complaint. He said there was definitely another voice in the broadcast, and it was getting louder. He asked if we were running some kind of test or special program. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I switched between different monitoring systems, checked the tape reels, examined every piece of equipment in the control room. Everything was functioning normally. The broadcast was clean. There was no second voice. At that point, I probably should have called my supervisor, but I didn't want to wake him up over what might be nothing, especially in my first month on the job. Besides, I was trained for this. I could handle a technical glitch. The calls kept coming. 5 more in the next 30 minutes, all reporting the same thing. A man's voice speaking beneath the regular broadcast. One caller said it sounded like he was reading numbers. Another said it sounded like coordinates. A woman called and said her husband, who had served in World War II, thought it sounded like military code. I was starting to panic. I couldn't hear anything wrong with the broadcast in the control room, but clearly something was going out over the airwaves that I wasn't picking up on our monitors. That's when I remembered the old emergency backup receiver in the storage closet, a vintage unit from the 1950s that the previous technician had kept around for some reason. I pulled it out, plugged it in, and tuned it to our frequency. At first, just our normal programming, but then I heard it. Faint, but definitely there. A man's voice speaking in a monotone, reading what sounded like a series of numbers and letters. My blood ran cold. This was exactly the kind of broadcast interruption that could get us shut down by the FCC. But where was it coming from? It wasn't originating from our equipment. Someone, somehow, was piggybacking on our signal. I made the decision to trace the source. Our transmitter was located about 2 miles outside of town, and I had the keys. If something was interfering with our broadcast at the transmission point, I needed to check it out. I grabbed my coat and the station's logbook, locked up the control room, and headed out into the February night. The drive to the transmitter site took about 15 minutes. It was located on a hill overlooking the valley, surrounded by a chain-link fence. As I pulled up, I could see our red beacon light blinking at the top of the tower, everything looking normal. But when I got out of the car, I noticed something that made me stop. There was another vehicle parked on the access road about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind some trees. No lights, no one inside that I could see, just sitting there in the dark. I approached the transmitter building slowly with my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door was locked, just as I had left it during my last inspection 3 days ago. I unlocked it and stepped inside, where all our broadcasting equipment hummed quietly in the temperature-controlled space. Everything looked normal. The meter showed standard output levels. The equipment was warm but not overheating. No signs of tampering. But according to that old radio receiver back at the station, there was definitely something else being broadcast alongside our signal. That's when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I waited for someone to knock or identify themselves, but there was only silence. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to open the door. No one there. The access road was empty. Even the mysterious vehicle I had seen earlier was gone. I drove back to the station faster than I probably should have, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I got back to the control room, I immediately checked the emergency receiver again. The mysterious voice was gone, just our regular programming, clean and clear. I didn't mention any of this in my shift report. I figured if I couldn't prove it with our official equipment, there was no point in opening myself up to questions I couldn't answer. But I did start making notes in a personal journal just in case it happened again. 2 days later, my supervisor pulled me aside. He asked if I noticed anything unusual during my shift on the 12th. I told him about the calls from listeners reporting a second voice, but that I couldn't find any problems with our equipment. He nodded slowly, then told me something that made my stomach drop. Apparently, the FCC had received multiple reports about our station that night. They'd even monitored our broadcast remotely, and they'd picked up the same thing the listeners reported. A man's voice reading what appeared to be coded information buried just beneath our regular broadcast. But here's what made it truly disturbing. The FCC's analysis suggested the pirate signal wasn't just interfering with our broadcast. It was modulated in a way that suggested it had been integrated at the transmission point, not from an external source. Someone had physically accessed our transmitter and modified it to carry a secondary signal that would only be audible on certain types of receivers. The even stranger part is that when they sent technicians to inspect our equipment 3 days later, they found no evidence of tampering. No modifications, no additional hardware, nothing that could explain how the secondary broadcast had occurred. Our equipment was pristine, functioning exactly as it should. My supervisor told me the FCC was treating it as an unsolved case of broadcast piracy, but they had no leads. No one had been seen in the area, no strange vehicles reported, nothing. It was as if the pirate broadcaster had been a ghost. I kept working at the station for another 8 months, but I requested to be moved to day shifts. I never worked overnight again, and I never told anyone about the vehicle I had seen parked near the transmitter that night, or the footsteps I had heard outside the door. To this day, I still don't know what was being broadcast at night or why, but I did some research years later and discovered something unsettling. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies used something called number stations, shortwave radio broadcasts that would transmit coded messages to operatives in the field. They were always just a voice reading numbers, letters, or coordinates, exactly like what I had heard. Our little radio station in Birmingham, Alabama had somehow become a carrier for something we were never meant to transmit, and whoever was responsible disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the memory of that strange voice in the darkness, reading its secrets into the night.